Dr. Nuremberg's mind-body workout system.
Well, welcome, our dear brothers and sisters, my beloved wife, Maheen, and Professor Julian Camacho, who's been a professor of history and Mexican-American studies for over 15 years. We're honored, truly honored that you came here. You took time out of your busy schedule to be with us for the conversation we're going to have today. Hopefully this will help uplift people who see it, give a deeper understanding to what's happening in our society in a constructive and positive way. First, I'll just introduce the concept of what we're talking about. We'll be talking about the social revolution of dialogue, a Mexican-American perspective. And I just talked to Professor Camacho this morning about it. Essentially, the old social contract that we have in this country is that 95% of the time it's superficial conversation. And the new social contract that I'm advocating is that we want to have it 50-50, 50% of the time superficial, 50% of the time deep. The old social contract, there was a lock-in. Once you got going on a superficial conversation, it's almost impossible to get out of it. The new social contract, that's suspended. You can go superficial, deep, superficial again. In the old social contract, only certain subjects were socially appropriate. In the new social contract, everything's socially appropriate, as long as the conversation proceeds with a respectfully real means of communication, that is, with kindness, wisdom, and respect of boundaries. Now, most people aren't even aware there is an old social contract. It's been in our society. And one theory I've had about it in a book that I called The History and Morality of Nations, The Emergence of the New Social Contract, is that it's a plunderer's contract. This is a theory now of history that I have, that when one people dominates another, conquers, they will then set up their own rules and laws and regulations and prosecute people for violating those rules and regulations, even though they're the plunderers, and install a social contract which would say it's inappropriate for you to even talk about it. Because if you're keeping everything on a superficial basis, no one says, well, you just plundered this, you just did this, you raped, you pillaged. No one can even say anything about anything. So if you look at a plunderer's viewpoint, that would be an excellent social contract to have, even if there was legal recourse to speak of these things. As a tremendous social pressure not to. It would be very inappropriate in our society. Say, well, what do you think about life? What do you think of death? As soon as you meet somebody, as opposed to people taking a long time to really coming around to talking about what's happening. I was myself very alienated growing up of Jewish heritage. I was very alienated. I didn't feel like I was an American until I was 50. Then I claimed this as my nation. I love America. I love the whole noble spirit of America. But I felt alienated because I grew up talking deeply with my cousins, and we'd be talking and disagreeing and then coming to some conclusions together, even from a point of differences to points of agreement. And then I found that this was not appropriate. Most of what's going on was, I couldn't relate to it. So many people talk about their hairdos, what they did to their cars. Very descriptive conversations. I did this and the other thing. And also part of the new social contract is if it's a social situation, they go da 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 da, ha 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 ha. So there's usually a laughter about every 30 seconds. It goes da 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 da, ha 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 ha. And I typically wouldn't find it funny. And also there's a type of, with that social contract, there's also an agreement to smile a certain amount. So there's what I call showing of teeth. And I used to see people smiling. I couldn't relate to the smile going on. So it's all part of that social contract. There's certain rounds of laughter. And I love to laugh. I love humor, but I couldn't relate to it. Then in my 60s, over time, I came to understand there's a contract here. It's an unspoken contract. And then I began to wonder, well, what about other people who come in who were in our culture? If you look at the great Mexican people, the great contributions of Mexican-American people in terms of politically, in terms of professionally, in terms of the arts, medicine, politics, tremendous values on family values that are brought here, the hard work, a culture of people coming here, making these enormous contributions while maintaining an attitude of humility and servitude. It's been an amazing journey for the Mexican-American people. But I think seeing the level of conversations and perhaps wanting to assimilate and participate in that and be accepted, I'd like to hear your perspective on how people of Mexican American background respond to the old social contract and how open you feel it would be with the new social contract.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Very deep topics. I think part of the point that you bring up, especially you mentioned the idea of plunder, is probably the starting point to the particular conversation, because we drive down Whittier Boulevard, right past the freeway. There's the old historical monument to Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor. And if you go there, it almost seems like that house is out of place. You have this freeway and the noise, but at the same time, it kind of tells you, the previous country that was here. And once you go beyond just, well, what was this place, you realize that you have two countries, one on top of the other. And that occurred back in 1848 when the U.S. literally moved into northern Mexico. So it became the Southwest. So you have that kind of history of plunder and domination from that particular time, where you mentioned that a new superpower came in, set up rules, set up laws, persecuted. And I think that as the old sort of existing culture somewhat went away and the new one came in, that clash, I think, develops, especially because you have a lot of those values still in place. And that could, I think, the clash comes in from wanting to dominate one over the other. And we see it real simple in terms of labor exploitation that translates then into racial exploitation, which they really go hand in hand. But at the same time, you've had quite a long time now, 150 plus, 160 years. So you also have now had the development of this new American culture that has, in essence, forced kind of like a duality. So the Whittier area goes from being known as Rancho de Bartolo to Whittier, but you still have these two cultures hand in hand, what you're really living is, I think, a particular culture conflict, and that can sort of drive anybody schizophrenic, from language to identity. And I think the biggest factor is the clash that comes from the Protestant sort of Catholic culture. And even though people would think they shouldn't be merged, at one hand, you do, because both are, in essence, really cultural institutions that impose. So, for example, discussing certain topics, Protestant culture, especially with the Quakers sort of being given credit for Whittier, also imposes a new kind of way of thinking, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think that permeates a particular culture overall. You can't say certain things because it's unacceptable, even if they're correct. And I think we sort of have developed into this era that's politically correct. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and I find that that's where a lot of the modern persecution is coming in. Then I think a second challenge is the definition of Mexican American is very, everybody thinks it's kind of simple, but it's actually very broad, because you have, in my opinion, almost 4 or 5 different levels of groups of people. So you have the old existing people that were really just Native Americans who had been Catholicized, or not necessarily Catholicized, but then they're the initial people who deal with this conquest. And then the secondary groups of people, I would argue, are the ones that most people think are Mexican Americans, which are the people who have moved from central Mexico up to the southwest, the desert, to California, for opportunity, for a job, or they were recruited, or they came to live with a family member. And I think that group of people are looking for a place to exist. And that creates a particular culture clash, I think, within them, but also within those that are already here. Because in essence, they bring in different cultural values. And one of the big cultural values I think they bring in is they're kind of like medieval Catholicism that took place in central Mexico during the 17th century, 18th century. Whereas in the deserts, Catholicism never really conquered the population. So the population in the north, they haven't been detribalized, but everybody has been, in essence, suburbanized into individual homes. And so it's very difficult to pinpoint, who thinks one way, who thinks another way. But they arrive with their particular cultural values, which is, like I said, very medieval Catholicism. And I think that creates a social norm, which very much drives how they think they should believe, how they act. And then on top of that, with the Protestant culture in place, then it's like you have these two types of, like you said, social contracts. And that can create a cultural confusion, especially for the people in the north. They're trying to figure out their particular place of acceptance. What are the particular rules, stability, lack of stability?
Well, let me interject. One, I feel was an excellent context. You gave us the whole context of what's happening here historically. And that greatly enhances the understanding of these old social contract and new social contract. Also, you illuminate the religious background. And also, I, from my perspective, the Mexican American people are deeply spiritual. I mean, deeply spiritual. I mean, it's not just on the surface, but it's deeply rooted to the relationship to the Creator. It's one of the aspects of greatness of the culture is the spiritual power. Now, in terms, I would imagine people then want to then fit in and speak the way that other people are speaking. Conversation going, well, I just bought a new car today. Oh, no, you got a new car. And yeah, I put in this and that and the other thing. And boy, I opened it up and it did 125 miles an hour. It's doing it up in Palm Desert there, Palm Springs. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we're in Palm Springs. Well, that freeway that was there, goes into the town itself. Oh yeah, I know that town. Yeah, I have a cousin that lives there. And it goes on and on. Very descriptive conversation. This is a key aspect of superficial conversation is typically very descriptive, as opposed to abstract, getting some abstraction, getting some depth going on. So when we interviewed 1,800 people in Whittier, so at least half the people are probably Mexican American.
Right.
If they were getting tired of the superficial conversations, most of them want to have so much superficiality. Most people feel lonely. They want deeper conversations. We found that people are more joined to even remember the opposite sex was deep as opposed to superficial. And most people feel if we speak more deeply from our heart, we'll see not that different from each other, where the oneness of humankind is more easily recognized because we're all similar.
Right.
So, and we found that people even rather purchase goods and services from somebody that's deep as opposed to superficial. Right. Like, keeping in mind that the depth is of content and also where the smile, where the laughter comes from, whether it's just something like on the teeth or it's really coming from here, the facial expression and so forth. So what I like to ask with your expertise is what influence, how is it the old social contract of 95% time superficial, only certain subjects be socially appropriate, and there's a lock into that superficiality. What effect has that had on the Mexican Americans here?
Well, I think on one hand, it's silenced a particular conversation in various places. I think on the one hand, I think at the workplace that it's almost non-existent. But the issue with the workplace, we spend a lot of time there. Rivals the home. So it turns out that the place where we want to, I think, just by human nature, have a conversation turns out to be a place of animosity, where everybody, I think, is backstabbing each other, willing to slash each other's throat, conniving. And I think that creates a very big conflict. I know that my mother, I think I listened to her enough, but the first rule she told me when I first started working, 16 or 17, was, don't really talk at work. And I think she was alluding, now as I see back 22, 23 years later, what she was saying is, don't open yourself up, because those places, that's not a place, for sharing and sharing your thoughts or your feelings, because everybody's really an enemy. And it took me a long time to learn that. I learned it the hard way. But I think she's kind of right.
So was she saying that because the natural propensity would be to talk honestly and openly?
Right.
That'll be the natural propensity. Well, at the core of the new social contract, which is 50% times deep, and there's no social lock and everything's socially appropriate as long as respectfully real communication, the core is based on the premise that we have the right to be who we really are. We have the right to be who we truly are, as long as the expression of who we are is done in a constructive way, a respectfully real manner. That's at the core of this. And then to the extent that that's being blocked, then we all become unnatural with each other. So that unnaturalness, where a mother would have to say, she's basically saying, don't be who you are.
Right.
So hide who you are.
Right.
That was the message.
Right.
And so then if it was done with you, that message was probably, I think it's there for other Mexican Americans, I'm sure, given that you can't be who you are.
Right.
You have to pretend to be somebody else.
Right.
So who did you end up pretending to be?
I'm not quite sure, because on the one hand, I didn't abide by her rules.
Okay.
So I tried to be myself.
Right.
But I realized that was particularly clashing. So it's no coincidence there. Every job I've had, and I'm not sure I'm the only one. I've always had great conflict, because at least for me personally, I haven't been able to be myself, because the rules are there's certain things you can't say. It's almost to the point where you don't really want to talk, but I don't think humans are made that way. I think humans they want to converse. They want, especially if they're spending time with somebody.
Now we're talking about conversing. I make two different. I'll make a distinction between real and being respectful.
Mm-hmm.
Being a real person might say, I'll be real with you. I never liked you. I'm never going to like you. I'd rather soon never even see you again. I'm just being real with you.
Right.
Now that's not respectfully real, because respectfully real would create a connection, a bridge that creates a barrier. So the flip side of that, which is usually hiding vulnerability, the vulnerability would go like this. When you said what you did the other day, I felt humiliated. If you could find it in your heart to apologize, I'd be grateful. And that's being honest. I'm really saying what's in my heart. It's a deeper level, actually. So it's about respectfully real communication. So we're not talking about insulting the boss, criticizing the boss in front of the coworkers, humiliating them. We're talking about a respectfully real communication. And as far as I can tell, my observation of Mexican Americans, if you treat a Mexican American with respect, you tend to get treated back with respect. I think that's a norm in the society. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think part of that thinking is that that's what we want. So if that's what we're seeking, then we're going to give that. But I think part of the problem is that different cultural discussion where we're having, where on the one hand you're acting how you think you should act culturally, but the outside culture is just the opposite, especially in a society that's much more hierarchical, where you're supposed to sort of take rules and commands unilaterally without question. I was mentioned that the southern Mexicans who move up, they seem to adjust better to that. And I think it goes back to maybe the whole Catholicism, 3 centuries, where they were sort of conditioned to follow orders, and that seems to work for them. But the northern Mexicans, come from Apache, Navajo, uh, Yuma heritage, and they were never conquered by anybody except the heat. And I think that gave them, they were much more free spirited, and the isolation, I think, gave them a certain kind of protection. So their response tended to be much more free. But when the U.S. arrives, it's another type of hierarchical society, just the way that was found in central Mexico under Catholicism. Now we just call it Protestantism because that's the social value.
So in terms of the alienation, what has happened to Mexican Americans trying to fit into that, accepting the old social contract? How difficult is that? Well, for you, for example, for you, it didn't work. You got fired a lot. And of course, I personally have the same issue. My father used to say, we Nurembergs have to work for ourselves in our blood. And besides, when we work for other people, they fire us. So I was forced to have to find my way also outside of fitting in, because the truth for me was, if I could have fit in, I would have. I never would have gone in business myself.
Right.
I really, if I could have worked at a hospital or a county clinic and stayed there, I never would have left. Yeah. But I literally couldn't fit in. I could not fit into the type of constraints that I would just feel. And it was basically a statement, you can't be who you are. And that was extremely difficult for me. And apparently what it has been for you.
Right.
And if we talk also then for the Mexican American people, from what you're saying, that would be harder for the northern people from the north.
Correct.
Than the southern could fit into that more southern Mexican. Right. The northern Mexican have a tougher time giving up that identity.
Right. Yeah, because I think they're being asked to give up a particular freedom of who they are, something that they've always had. And I think that's, when you don't have that particular tradition of a very focused hierarchy and authoritative system, then I think it's hard, because you want to be free all the time. And I think that at least from my perspective at the workplace, that becomes I think a real big challenge, because we have to follow orders. Not that we're not good at following orders, but the part of it is we just don't particularly trust the orders sort of being given. I learned that the hard way in particular. So, because I think on the one hand, I think we do want that sense of security, the simpleness, like you said, of working at in my situation, at a school. But I think early on, you're being sort of told, you're being given a script, what to do, what to follow, what not to say.
Well, let's extrapolate from there into social situations. Sitting around a coffee shop, sitting around some situation in a coffee shop, on a plane, in a waiting room, wherever, the conversations that go on, or at a party. Let's go to the social aspect. The old social contract certainly applies there. It's also 95% of the time superficial, 5% deep. Although new social contract will be 50-50, 50% of the time superficial, 50% of the time deep. At this time, to my knowledge, no society has 50% of the time deep. But that's what the new social contract that we're bringing calls for. So what happens then? Well, we saw here in Whittier, again, half the people interviewed of this 1,800 want more deep conversation. What would be your sense of the Mexican American community being offered the new social contract and saying, yes, I believe in the new social contract? What would be the pros and the cons for Mexican American community?
Well, I think the first one is probably getting them to believe that it's possible. I think
yeah.
I think there's the initial skepticism. Is that really possible when the history has sort of demonstrated that not included in part of that social.
Well, let's start right here. See, let's say somebody had a logo that says respectfully real. It says respectfully real. There's pins, and they can have something on their shirt, whatever. So we're not therefore trying to change society to the new social contract, not at all. But if I see you and I see you have Respectfully Real, so you believe in the new social contract. Because half the people, there's probably at least 50 million people in this country, Mexican American and others, who are all ready for this.
Right.
So I see you accept the new social contract, so I don't have to chit chat with you. Is that right? Yeah. Well, okay. What do you think about life, death? What's really going on in political situations right now? We go right to it instead of having to lead up to it and go through the wasting time. Because the greatest natural resource is being squandered. The natural resource being words. People are just squandering it on nothing, where nobody's benefiting from the conversations. They're entertaining each other a little bit, but it's not really doing anything to improve our understanding of life, of each other, of ourselves, how to live healthier lives or anything else. It's just passing the time. So once a person sees another person has Respectfully Real logo, he says, well, he accepts it. Mexican American, Anglo, whatever, he accepts. I can talk to this guy.
Yeah.
How would that be for Mexican American?
Well, I think people would be open to that. I know that from my circle of friends, anytime we find somebody, doesn't matter what color they are, but we sense that there's that respect, we instantly sort of magnetize to them. We've had that experience with a black friend of mine that I knew, and we found each other after 20 years, and just sort of opening discussion. It was kind of like very positive experience, thinking that.
It took 20 years. That's the point. It took 20 years. 20 years. If people had Respectfully Real on them, it might only take 6 months.
Right.
You find people all the time. You might even have Respectfully Real coffee shops, Respectfully Real cruises. People would have the logo on them. There would be no guesswork. Because right now it would be very socially inappropriate to say to somebody, hey, well, I just met you, but I want to ask you, what do you think about life? What do you think about death? What do you think about being an eternal soul? I mean, that would be considered, you just met me. Who are you talking to? You don't even know me. Why are you talking like that? So it'd be inappropriate. So, but if you have the Respectfully Real logo on, I know I can talk to you like that.
I think we're always looking for that too.
And this is why we'll be able to identify you. That's the whole goal of the social revolution of dialogue, is not to change the whole society, but just for people who already believe in a new social contract to accept it, to already believe in it, to be able to find others who believe in it. And from what we can see, since half the people we interviewed here, or at least half were Mexican Americans, because the whole survey of 1,800 was in the Whittier area, it seems that over half the Mexican Americans would like to wear a logo to that effect. Is that correct, or is that an over-exaggeration?
No, I think so. You mentioned something earlier that we do our shopping based on that human connection. And I think you're correct. I think I hadn't thought about it, but I know that I always go back to the places where they acknowledge me and make me feel welcome. So I'm faithful to that environment across the board.
I know my wife and I go to one family restaurant. We always go there. We like the feeling, the price of the food, the taste of the food, but the people themselves, the connection, the sense of being welcome. So let me ask you this: if the Mexican American people in this area knew about the social revolution of dialogue and that they can wear the logo Respectfully Real, do you think they would want to wear it?
Oh, I think so.
So it's just a matter of people knowing. So this revolution has been going on for over a year. I think nobody knows about it.
No, I think so, because I think they're always looking to identify who can they get close to. Family members, by marriage that I had as a kid, were white, were Anglo, and I remember thinking that they were the norm. But I remember that I sort of thought of white people as that being, they were all that way.
Which way was that?
Very friendly.
Very friendly, yeah.
Very open. Well, they were family members.
Right.
But then once I went out of that circle, I found myself clashing, because not everybody was like these people that were family members. Some have died. One was a step-grandfather. So I think that took me a long time to sort of get over that not everybody acts the same. So I think deep inside, you're always sort of looking for that particular sense of security.
Do you think the Mexican American people in general are looking for connection?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that search for connection, and not having it would lead to a sense, I would imagine, of isolation and loneliness.
And I think especially because we're we're very connected to space where we live. It's that's our identity, and anybody who lives in that particular space is thought of as particular family members. Doesn't matter what nationality or what group they are. The fact that they all grew up in the same space sort of bonds them, and I think that's a very powerful strength. I mean, I think we get associated with gangs as a negativity, but their identity is that neighborhood. So
They protect that
they
neighborhood.
protect that neighborhood.
They're loyal to one another. It's a sense of connection. It becomes
Exactly.
family to a large extent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The definition of family is not just blood, but it's everybody who lives there. So there is this positive attribute that can very well work into this idea of seeking somebody, who's respectful to each other, because it sort of blends in with that way of thinking.
What we found was that the idea was that if we all talk more deeply from our hearts to one another, we'd see we're not that different.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd see, therefore, the oneness of humankind, a very basic spiritual principle, become more manifest. Whereas if we're just chit-chatting and keeping it superficial and about the script of things and avoiding the contact, it's harder to see that we all have the same basic needs.
Right.
We'll get hurt. We'll feel vulnerable. We have the same joys and sorrows in life. None of us are that different.
Right.
We all have to deal with sickness, illness, death.
Yeah.
We're all going to go through this.
Right.
So your feeling is then that the new social contract, a 50% of the time deep conversation, and no lock into that superficial conversation when it gets going, and that everything is socially appropriate as long as we talk to each other in a respectfully real manner, that people, Mexican Americans, would gladly wear the logo saying, I accept this. More than half the Mexican Americans would be open to this and want this.
Oh, I think so. Yeah.
And cherish that.
Right.
See, that's so what does it take then to make that happen? It's now being announced that such a thing exists. It now goes under the title Social Revolution of Dialogue. Again, it's not a political revolution. It's not a violent revolution. And it's not a thing. It's not an idea to change anybody. It's a matter of saying people are already craving this.
Right.
Because there's tremendous loneliness in the world,
Right.
which in this society, perhaps more so than most. I had a brother-in-law who came from another country. He came here and he said, I came here for freedom. And he said, but all I do is work. So he found himself in a situation he didn't quite expect. But so what would it take then for the Mexican American community to become aware of this opportunity to say, I accept a new social contract and I would like to portray myself as such so that other people feel free to talk to me and I could see others whom I could talk to, whether Mexican American, Anglo, Black, or Asian, or whatever. What would it take to bring that to the Mexican American community?
But I think the one simple thing is reaching out, letting them know that this is possible, that this does exist, that we that there is interest and a broad commonality. And I think once they become aware of it, I think people will reach out. One of the strange, I know I criticized religion, Catholicism, Protestantism. I don't mean so in the sense of that it's a bad thing, because there's positive aspects to them. I mean, I think one of the reasons they coexist is they reach out at the human level. Now they're doing it under, they have their ideas and their beliefs, and that's okay. But they, in essence, are doing things that I think the outside could follow, not necessarily following their doctrine, like you said, but more on the human aspect. And I think most people, what they find from them is just being able to connect with another human individual. So I think I'm doing the same thing that churches do, reaching out, proselytizing, but in the sense of just information. I think that goes a long ways, because I think once that's understood, I think people flock to that.
Well, you've already given me a lot of information. You've already taught me just talking with you about the Mexican American people and the dynamics that go on. So in terms of reaching out, so what would be the way? Would the media get involved? So here we're talking about social revolution of dialogue. And I say, Professor Camacho, how do we bring this, you and I together, to bringing this forth? And I say, how do we design this? Do we set up an appointment with the radio announcers? Do we set it up with the newspapers, the Mexican American newspapers. Just to let you know, I brought it to the local paper here and the Daily News, the Woody Daily News, and yeah, they said, "Oh, this is great. We'll send a reporter up," and never did. And I dropped off a media package. I still haven't heard from them. So nobody's jumping, even though there's a craving for this and a huge need, because the loneliness and isolation really helps feed substance abuse. I mean, people, if they were able to speak to each other more openly and have more connection, wouldn't be turning to drugs as much,
Right.
alcohol as much. There'd be fewer suicides. So it has a lot of social consequences overcoming this kind of loneliness. And the loneliness that's really devastating is our seniors, the people are getting older, they just left alone, no one's even talking to them. So if they knew, gee, I can talk to this person about what matters to me, I can talk to this person, it would allow them not to just be sitting there waiting to die, which we have a lot of these retirement homes, which is basically the attitude. They live their lives just waiting now to go on. So you and I, so we have a high about this little conversation now. Where do we go from here to bringing it out? I mean, I'm telling you about it. My students have come here before. My patients, I've told about it. But it really hasn't been launched. It's not really successfully gone, although there's a craving. I have people who tell me, yeah, I'd like to have 50% of the time deep conversation. What percentage do you have? About 5. Are you lonely? Yes, very lonely. Because they want 50%. They'd like to be able to really talk about what matters, and only doing it 5% of the time. It's painful for people.
Right.
So, and all groups must be having this. And then if Mexican Americans are just trying to fit in, they're going to want to copy that old social contract.
Right.
If I want to fit in here, I got to somehow talk like that. I have to somehow do that. Right. And I just even wonder whether Mexican Americans really can do it. I can't violate myself to that extent. So I wonder then if most Mexican Americans want to even mix then with society at large as opposed to being with each other, because it cannot. So the reason I'm saying this, I couldn't do it. Yeah. And I'm not Mexican American, but I literally couldn't force myself to do this thing. So is there a large percentage of Mexican Americans who cannot force themselves to have those kind of conversations that much of the time?
No, I think it's mixed. I think it's, I think it could go 50-50. And what I mean by that, I think the power of a simulation is a very powerful force. But it's also, I think, driven by gender. What drives, I know that on the one hand, you have, I think, the bodily functions of nature, what men crave. I think women crave it too, but in a different way. And I think what we were talking about loneliness, I think there's also a gender aspect that's playing out in terms of the messages. On the one hand, I think the females are being told you can be independent, you can be all that you want to be, break away from the traditionalism. I think they're following that, where the men don't have the same escape clause, which is why we see that there's more men who go by the way of drugs and alcohol and jail, or we end up dying much earlier. So there's also that aspect to reach out at a gender level. So
you're saying the Mexican American male can't get away from a certain aspect of how he was raised, at least to an earlier death, through these other ways. And what is it they can't? What is it that the Mexican American male can't get away from? What's harder to get away from?
Well, one, I think being subscribed, they don't have a role anymore. Their identity as a male has been diminished. He's not the provider. He's his nature of the macho character has been identified as negative, when it was really a survival mechanism that was taught by the mother. So that positive characteristic has been alienated. And the alienation, on the one hand, has come from dominant society, but I also think that that's an issue in all men.
It is.
But the machismo thing is really identified with Mexican Americans, because they get identified as wife beaters, all the negative. But there's a lot of other positives, because there's really two definitions: one that provides, one that takes care of. And then the females are also buying into the assimilation. So I tend to think that the assimilation tends to be much more easier for women, which creates, I think, a different type of acceptance for women, but not for men, or in vice versa. There's a much harder rejection for the men. than the women.
Well, let me ask you this, because part of respect for real communication often requires speaking of vulnerability. So, the machismo thing, when, you said that to me, and so I was standing up, and it's right in your face, like being to talk to me that way, as opposed to saying, I felt hurt by that. Or saying to his wife, no, I feel jealous. You talked to that guy so long. I feel jealous because I love you and I'm possessive of you. Felt jealous, maybe you might hit her or whatever. How hard will it be for, given the machismo background of all men, we're talking about Mexican Americans right now, to then be able to express the vulnerability, and it's not weakness. So a man could say, I love you and I feel jealous. So you talk to me. I appreciate you don't talk to this guy that much because on your mind, I don't like that. And I'm sharing with you that I'm trying to speak to you in a gentle and in a way of letting you know what's underneath that, because otherwise you just go into attack mode. Or say, when you said what you did, I felt hurt. I need some kindness from you because I feel hurt right now. Or I feel very insecure. Everything's going wrong. I feel overwhelmed and insecure, because typically people cover up the vulnerability with anger or aloofness or an independence that doesn't even exist. So what I've discovered in over 35 years of researching myself and an observer of human nature is that under all negativity is vulnerability. How hard will it be then? And truly honest communication is to communicate the vulnerability, not as a statement of weakness, but a statement of honesty. I'm telling you this, you don't think you can walk over me. I'm just letting you know, I feel hurt, I feel insecure, but I'm secure enough in myself to tell you that. Don't think it's weakness, it's not. Right. So how hard will that be, that kind of respectfully real communication from Mexican American male?
I think that speaking with a stranger, female stranger, that I think it's almost nearly impossible at that particular level, because this person's a stranger, so you don't have a particular bond, you don't have that connection. On top of that, I think that because society sort of, I think, treats the males, Mexican American males, as a commodity, I think females are now thinking that way. So that's at one level. I think the other sort of part B to that is that, women ultimately pick the men. So a male's ego, I think, at a certain point goes up and down depending on the response they get from females, right? Which is why I sometimes think that the male camaraderie tends to be much more stronger. It's not that they're looking for, it's not a sex issue. It's a brotherhood. It's a bonding. It's a type of love that.
What I see with Mexican American men is very powerful friendships, loyalty, deep friendship. Become like brothers. I mean, it's a tremendous contribution to our society, because I think other groups need that kind of friendship as well.
No, I think so, because I think that they're finding that particular bond. That's why when that kind of friendship ends because one is taking advantage of the other, it's devastating. And that happens quite often, especially I think in our material-prone society, where one wants to take advantage of the other. Now, I think on the other hand, the machismo, I think within the relationship with the family, I think it isn't so much that he wants to protect, he wants to take care of, and I think that becomes a different kind of challenge, because his place is not particularly there. Now we're seeing that the unemployment, as we've seen that it's affected everybody, but it has a high percentage on Mexican American males. So in a material-based society, for them, to be surviving or not being able to survive is particularly devastating, and that can create all kinds of cultural identity issues and suicidal, or just not feeling good enough. And I understand that the pressure exists for everybody, so it's not just them, but among a group of people whose roles were defined by that I think that can be very devastating.
Well, if you look at males in general, it has been the case that many men, after they retired, were dead within 6 months,
right? Because
their identity was their work.
Right.
No longer working, they had no purpose in life. Certainly to live person has a sense of direction, purpose, and meaning. And for most men, it's been their work. And so something needs to expand beyond that. But how hard would it be? We could say any male would be hard, but we're talking about Mexican American men saying, I feel diminished, insecure in my role in life. I really need a lot of support from my friends. I'm vulnerable at this time. I honestly believe that communication would be responded to by his friends.
Yeah,
they would understand that.
Yeah, I think so.
But I wonder whether that communication's. I don't think it's happening in the world, Mexican American or anybody else. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think I think it happens sort of quietly, where I think people respond with the best they can, within their particular limitations. But sometimes that inner circle of friendship could be one or two. So it's not abroad, so not a lot of people know about it. I think that's where it becomes a challenge. I mean, I work at in the admission college in the San Fernando Valley, where the ambiance is nobody gives a damn about whether you survive or not.
Right.
So you get a class cut as a part timer, and all of a sudden, you really are literally one door out on homelessness. And I think we have to get away from that kind of particular environment. I think that's in that social construct. And I think that's the challenge. We're how do we get away from sort of the me and sort of take a broader kind of like a communal approach?
Well, ultimately what has to happen in business is this, and I wrote a book called Law, the Key Factor about this. The respectfully real communication in the workplace is fairness.
Right.
Justice. Now, if you're unfair, you're not just, you're going to have all kinds of harassment claims, workers' compensation claims, litigation, reduced productivity. If you're fair with people, the guy may not like your decision. Say, I don't like this, but you know what? It's fair. They'll do it. Right. So it has to be perceived as fair. And I've developed a whole fairness training program. So because people feel, well, am I being discriminated against because I'm a female, a male, Mexican American, Black, Jew, whatever? I was wondering, how come it's always fair? This guy violates the rules and he gets away with it. I do one little thing and I'm written up.
Right.
So these perceived injustices, which are often accurate, it's not just fantasy. These things are going on. So in terms of the ultimate of being respectfully real in the workplace, fairness is at the key. And all management techniques without fairness will fail. I don't care, and no one's teaching this.
Right.
So I have a whole program for that, fairness, and that's respectfully real communication. That's respectfully real communication in the workplace is fairness. So in terms of bringing then this type of communication, so let's say two friends see that they both accept. I've not even known people for years, and I didn't know I could really talk to them. Then I found out, I tried talking. I said, we can really talk. I didn't know. I've known you all these years. I didn't know we could. So it's not just meeting new people. People, once they understand that you can really talk to this person. So if they had the respectfully real logo on, say, I can really talk to you. Now, some of those conversations may still backfire, but at least it opens up a deeper, more meaningful life, a more exciting life. So again, we go to the idea that, you and I might have known each other 5 years and never really talked. And then I see you've got respectfully real. I go, you accept a new social contract too. I never asked you, what do you really think of this? Or I never did tell you that time when I went to see you and I felt slighted. I felt kind of hurt. You didn't say hello to me. A person may want to be willing to share that once I understand you accept the new social contract. So that's both in terms of new relationships as well as relationships where you've known people a long time would open up being able to talk at a more real level, whether realness has to do with vulnerability or whatever the issue is. So it'll be a tremendous contribution. What do you see as affect this, to the extent that the Mexican American population comes aboard the new social contract? Well, half already do, but acknowledge it by wearing a logo to that effect. What effect do you feel that would have on the Mexican American community, where they are identified with some logo on them, where they know they can talk to?
Well, one of the things as you were discussing, it hit me that one of the things that I always have enjoyed doing, and I don't think I'm the only one. This thing is across the board within the culture, is conversing. I was reading an article one day about the differences in San Diego and Tijuana. San Diego goes to sleep at 8 p.m. and Tijuana, chats the whole night. And I think that if there's one thing that they do like to do is converse, and I think that could very much work very well into the what is trying to be done. So you can build upon that cultural attribute of conversation. I see it among neighbors, among kids, older men, that they do like to talk, and they like to talk for a good amount of time. And I know that I have personally have always at least made the effort with my close friends to really build upon that, spend time, discussing, spend time talking. Because I used to see my father do it. I used to see my grandfather do it, and definitely have seen.
How common is that amongst Mexican Americans to see real deeper conversation going on with the elders and with the cousins and friends?
I think it's much more common at a particular level. You're much more willing to discuss with your immediate circle of friends. I think, and I remember my father was the same way, and my grandfather, right? It was at their particular level, but it had to be a close circle, because outside of that, then the discussions were not. I think they were much more superficial. But I think the foundation is there to build upon that particular.
Because it would accelerate the expansion of that inner circle. Mm-hmm. Because once you see this person accepts respectfully real the new social contract and respectfully real communication, then it'd be easier, be much more quickly integrated. So, well, the world expands out from this few people to many people.
Right. Well, one of the things that occurred in I think between Texas and California when the U.S. took over was the U.S. was very afraid of this congregation. I think part of it was they were afraid of revolts, but I think what they really missed out was what they didn't understand was this was a way of almost having like informal counsel. So one of the early rules that they put up were no loitering signs. So we still see signs throughout anywhere you go where it says no loitering, no loitering. I think in part of that has been to diminish this cultural, attribute where people did converse at whatever level they felt was important. So that's one of the examples of how new laws, right, plunders a very positive attribute. And I think, but the end result has been to sort of break away, I think, the kind of kinship that existed, and I don't think it had nothing to do with you weren't going to fight anybody with bows and arrows, but it was more about sort of socially conversing, which is why we don't really have that, because I think we've been legalized, forced into the house.
Well, it's interesting saying that, because I grew up, I would see the elders sitting in chairs and talking outside, and then as I moved away from where I was in New York, going to suburbia, I said, well, where's the people? People have porches. No one's on a porch. Right. You see some chairs around. No one's sitting in the chairs. I mean, you go through, somebody came from another planet, they'd go, well, it's an uninhabited planet or something. There's nobody around.
Yeah.
And if you go through the suburbs and tract homes, there's literally nobody outside. And I grew up, in Brooklyn, you just saw in Bronx, you saw Jewish people sitting there talking and maybe playing some checkers or whatever, and a lot of conversation happening. So I think there's been a tremendous drive to push people in, and right. You just mentioned some of the things about the loitering part. So that's one aspect of what took place, was the plunderer not afraid of right. people arising. That's a very good example of it. Well, I think if we have only a few minutes left, we can just see if there are any questions on what we've talked about. And perhaps people have something like to ask Professor Camacho, any aspects of what we've talked about.
Can I assume that you were born and raised in Southern California?
Yeah. Yes.
All your life?
Yes.
You never lived anywhere else?
No.
In the country?
No.
Okay, then can I say that, could a lot of your attitudes be based upon being a Southern Californian?
Absolutely.
And not necessarily a Mexican American?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
but they sort of go hand in hand. At least for me.
Right.
Yeah, because it's very much. But one is definitely the Mexican American part, but the other part, you're right, is very Southern California. Yeah. No, you're right.
Any other questions, Professor Camacho? Yeah.
Do you
Michael.
think that even though you were raised in Southern California, are there a certain set of social stratifications that are particular to the Chicano, Mexican Americans, and some of the jornaleros that come in from Mexico as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in simplistic terms, I think the issue of the labor, doing manual labor, is definitely one focus where I think people are sort of segregated into. Now I know that everybody, most men across the board do manual labor because that seems to be what's expected of the males. But without doubt, there is a particular expectation of what one should do. And I remember reading one of the essays from one of the students, and he pinpointed the fact that when he was in high school, the females, and he was talking about Mexican American, the females, work experience was to work in the office and do clerical kind of stuff, but the males were expected to do labor as part of that academic work training program. I think that's one level. I think the other level is there a certain kind of places we don't belong. I think, I myself, having been in schools, colleges, community colleges, and universities, I kind of feel like that's one particular place that we don't belong, simply because the expectation is, you don't have the particular knowledge, even though everybody technically who's hired there does.
Well, I think we're coming to, I'm getting a flag that we're ending, but certainly probably pretty hard for Mexican Americans to get into departmental politics, which brutalizes people of all races, including those who are ruling, the races that dominate also are brutalized by it. And I think it might be harder for certain groups to fit into that kind of political climate. It's pretty tough to take. But we want to thank you, Professor Camacho, for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's an honor to meet you and have your perspective on everything. And we want to thank Ruben for bringing you here. It's a great contribution. And so it's been a privilege and an honor to have everybody here for us to participate in this tremendous dialogue. And we're also grateful for those watching on DVD and those listening on CD. Thank you.